Okay, thank you.
Get your clicker.
I got my clicker.
So,
Okay, your clicker.
so I wasn't going to be here today, and so we had arranged for Sue to preach. And then when I knew I was going to be here, I said to Reggie and Edie, I suggested that we still have Sue preach. That way, at the end of the week, I didn't have to take care of Jack and Bonnie, scramble to get a sermon together, all of that. And many of you know Sue. Sue has been here a number of times. Sue, what's your title at Hayward?
Pastor of Youth and Community Outreach.
She's pastor of youth and community outreach at the Hayward CRC. And I got to know Sue quite well when she was in the Sierra Leadership Network. And so it's a pleasure for me to see you again today here, Sue, and I'm sure it'll be our pleasure to hear you preach. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. And greetings from your brothers and sisters at Christ Community. I was thinking on the way up here that this feels like a second home for me. I've been up here enough times now. Though I got to tell you, Paul mentioned that he was one of my instructors at Sierra Leadership, and this is a little deja vu because that was one of the things we used to have to do is do a message in front of your instructors. So put that aside for you. Well, several years ago, I was at a retreat put on by our women's ministry. And the speaker used a variety of art projects to try to encourage us to unleash our creative side, our creative selves. And during one of those sessions, I was working on a page that had as its subject some of the names of God. And while many of them were familiar, there was one that just sort of caught my eye and made me pause. The name was El Rohi, the God who sees me. And so I looked up the scripture reference and discovered that this was the name by which a woman called Hagar came to know Jehovah, a deity who most of her life was unknown to her. And so this morning I thought it might be interesting for us to sort of explore a little more about who Hagar was and how she came to embrace the name of El Rohi. Before we delve into her story, I'd like you to take a look at something, if I can. I have techno demons, and so things tend to go weird when I'm trying to do this. Never fails. Any clues to what this is?
Red Bear Rug.
Well, recently a friend of mine got married, and I wanted to give her and her husband a gift that was maybe a little bit unique. And so I began working on a cross-stitch project. And for those of you who are familiar with cross-stitch or if you've never done it, I'm going to tell you more about cross-stitch than you ever wanted to know. You make a picture using thread by following a pattern. You pick a place to start, and you just start working a stitch at a time. And you use various colors and thread, and you create a design. However, the color of thread that you're using, depending on the pattern, isn't necessarily consistent. There's a lot of back and forth and stops and starts and crossing over, and that can be what you see. But when you see it from a different perspective, a picture begins to emerge. That's where it's at right now. Eventually, it'll hopefully look like that. Okay? This is an ongoing project. It's incomplete. It's a work in progress. Now, I bring this up to illustrate the idea that when we look at the story of Hagar, we're going to be looking at one small part of a tapestry that God is weaving throughout the history of humankind. And to help make sense of it, we're going to backtrack a bit and review some of the backstory. So God had a plan. After God completed his creation of the world and the people in it he made to inhabit it, he declared it good, and it was for a while. But then the disobedience of human beings began, and the world that he entrusted was made a mess by their disobedience, including the relationship between humankind and God. Now, fortunately for us, God put into place a plan to restore what had been broken. And part of that plan was to establish or set apart a group of people with whom he would have an understanding, sort of a contract. Sometimes we call it a covenant. And he would take care of them, and they were to trust and obey him. Now God began with the family of one man. God often begins very small. He started with one man, Abram. Abram and his wife Sarai and the nephew Lot. They leave the land of their tribe and they follow God's leading to settle in a new land. And at one point there's a famine and they end up going back to Egypt for a period of time. And while there, Abram becomes a fairly wealthy man. His holdings include a number of servants, and among them is a young woman named Hagar, who's assigned to tend to the needs of Abraham's wife, Sarai. So we're going to pick up the story at Genesis 16. So Genesis 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai and his wife took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now she knows she's pregnant. She despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord brought Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now with child and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." This is why the well was called Bir Lahai-Roi. It's still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and son gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So let's stop there for a moment and sort of recap. God's relationship with Abram begins when Abram is already kind of getting up in years. He's 75 years old. And his wife is about 10 years younger. Now, up to that point in time, he and his wife haven't had any children. But from the beginning of the relationship, God has continued to assure Abraham that this will not always be the case. And in their interactions over the years, he's very specific that Abram will have a biological son. Well, about 10 years into this covenant, Sarai comes to the conclusion that she's getting pretty well past her childbearing years, and the only way Abram's going to have a biological son is through some other woman. And if that's the case, then perhaps God's going to need a little help from her to sort of get this show on the road. Well, as some of you may be aware, in ancient cultures, women who could not bear children were seen as less than. It was seen as an indicator that they were deficient, and it was considered to be a cause for a great shame. However, at that same time, there was also a tradition that a woman could adopt or take the child of her servant, sort of a forced adoption, and call it their child. So Sarai convinces Abram that this is the approach that they should take, and Abram goes along with it. And so Sarai gives Hagar and designates her as her surrogate. Hagar doesn't become pregnant, and then she begins to give Sarai attitude. Sarai complains to Abram, who takes this passive role and says basically, "You know what, she's your property, do with her what you want. You deal with it." Sarai proceeds to make Hagar's life miserable. We can assume that she becomes emotionally, if not physically, abusive towards Hagar. And in an act of desperation, Hagar runs away. She starts heading back to home, back towards Egypt. But then, as she's wandering in the desert, she stops beside a well to rest. And there she has her own encounter with God through an angelic messenger who asks an interesting question. Where have you come from and where are you going? And Hagar explains that she's running away. And the angel urges her to go back and assume that, and assures her that God is aware of her situation and he has things under control. He tells her that she will have a son who's going to be named Ishmael, which means God hears. And that child will go on through his own difficult circumstances, but ultimately God will bless her and the child that she is carrying. This is when Hagar gives God the name by which she'll always know him, El-Rahi, the God who sees me. She then turns around, heads back, and she submits herself once again to the youngship of Sarai, knowing full well that she will most likely face further abuse as a consequence of her running away. Matter of fact, the only thing that will probably save her life is the fact that she is carrying Abraham's child. Now fast forward about 14 years. God continues to have interactions with Abram, in which he restates his promise that there will be a child born to him who will be a biological child of both Abram and Sarai. And as confirmation of this promise, God has them change their names to Abraham and Sarah. Abram means exalted father, whereas Abraham means father of many. Sarai means my princess, but Sarah simply means princess, which indicated that she would be honored not just by her husband, but by an entire nation of people. We next hear of Hagar in chapter 21. It says, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, 'God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me.' And she added, 'Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.' The child grew and was weaned. But on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham had a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, 'Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac.' The matter distressed Abraham greatly, because it concerned his son. But God said to him, 'Do not be distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to what Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring.' Early in the morning, Abraham took food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down nearby, about a bow shot away, for she thought, 'I cannot watch the boy die.' And as she sat there nearby, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, 'What's the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him a great nation.' Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. When he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt." Would you like to have a mom like that? Finds your spouse for you. So I have 3 questions, and I'm looking for audience participation. First question: who do you like most in this story? Who do you like? Anybody?
God.
Like God, okay. All right. Other than God, is anybody in this story that you like?
Baby.
The baby. Yeah, yes. I'm with you. Who do you like the least in this story?
Sarah.
Sarah. Okay. Okay. Who would you pick as the hero? God. Good answer. You know, when we read the stories of the Bible, it's important to try to see things from the perspective of the people involved. And in this very small section of the tapestry of God's plan for the history of the world, we see a group of truly unique and complicated people. Abraham, the one chosen by God to begin a new nation. I mean, what an honor. And I find myself intrigued by his willingness to place total trust in this previously unknown God who he becomes aware of when he's in his 70s. His faith is so remarkable that three of the writers of the New Testament, Paul, James, and the writer of Hebrews, all refer to his faith. They refer to him as the one who sort of sets the standard for righteous faith. Yet, at the same time, he has these moments of failure that just don't quite fit with my expectations of what a godly person looks like. In one instance, when they're traveling in Egypt, he puts his wife Sarah in danger by telling Pharaoh that Sarah is his sister, and he does it in order to save his own neck. And in this account, with Hagar and Sarah, he refuses to defend the mother of his child and ultimately goes along with the proposed banishment of Hagar and Ishmael that will most likely lead to their deaths. What are we to make of that? And then there's Sarah. Because of cultural normatives, she sees herself as a victim of this God who makes all these promises to her husband and places seemingly impossible expectations on her, thereby making her the bad guy, or at least the failure in this grand scheme. When she finally devises a potential way out of the situation, she then has to deal with her feelings and fears of being replaced in her husband's affections towards a younger woman. And she reacts by being an abusive shrew towards the very people that she'd manipulated into doing what she wanted in the first place. And her jealousy isn't dissipated by the birth of her son, but rather it's magnified and it morphs into an extreme bitterness and downright murderous anger that explodes when Ishmael acts like the teenager that he is and makes fun of his little stepbrother, as teenage boys have been doing for years. She's willing to condemn two people to certain death because of her own insecurities. Now, Hagar is mostly a person who seems to deserve our sympathy. And she's a slave. She's a person with no rights regarding her body, her child, or her future. She's given to Abraham not as a person, but as a tool. Yet she's not a totally innocent player in this little family drama either. I mean, she has a vindictive side that comes out in her pregnancy. Some have even suggested that maybe she too thought that she had a chance at displacing Sarah in social standing as well as in Abraham's affection. So what are the lessons that we can take away from this complex and most assuredly dysfunctional family? I think there's a couple of things that stand out. First of all is the realization and confirmation that people are complicated. They just are. One of my warnings when we have new elders and deacons is that when you really get to know people, you find out everybody has flaws, and often some surprising ones. Abraham was a person who at times demonstrated remarkable faith, even exemplary faith. But there were also times when his faith wavered and even plunged into desperate unbelief and resulting sin. We're all broken, messy, complicated people. Recognizing that in ourselves can give us hopefully the humility to give the Holy Spirit room to work in us and to form us more and more into the people that God does desire us to be. And hopefully recognizing that in others reminds us to grant the same grace that we've been shown. Paul put it this way in his letter to the church in Philippi. I thank my God every time I remember you. And my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to the completion until the day of Jesus Christ. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and in depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless until the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. A second thought is this. When we try to run ahead of God, we can make a real mess of things. Fortunately, God can and does take our messes and turn them into something good. It's what we call redemption. In spite of Abraham and Sarah's mess-ups and moral failures, Abraham did indeed become the biological father of a geographical nation and a spiritual father to millions of people of faith. God's tapestry was not undone by their misunderstanding or their disobedience. What's more, God is also the redeemer of the situation of Hagar and Ishmael, a slave woman whose future is at the mercy of another woman's sadistic manipulations. Her child is reduced to a pawn in this sick game of family feud. Their fate appears dire as they face certain death in the desert, and Hagar cries out to God, and God answers. And God tells her that she too is a child of promise, that her son Ishmael will know God's blessing, that there is room in God's promises and covenants, within God's covenant, for those who perhaps others have written off as lost causes. And finally, we're told of the God who is El Rohi, the God who sees me. He sees both my own failings and weaknesses and the failings of others that impact me. He sees the injustice when others make false accusations or assumptions about me. He hears the cry of my heart as I struggle with the inner darkness that I don't dare tell anybody about. 2 weeks ago, I was serving as the chaplain at the West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat Center. This is a place where first responders, firefighters, law enforcement personnel, EMTs, dispatchers, and so on, they come there. These are people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress injuries. And they come for a week of intensive therapy. One of my responsibilities is to offer prayer before our evening meals, and I often try to include a brief meditation or spiritual insight in the process. Sometimes I tell a sort of a condensed version of this story of Hagar and her reference to God as El Rohi, the God who sees me. And I find that this particular Bible story receives the most reaction, often from those who have either walked away from their faith because of what they've been through or those who have never professed any particular spiritual understanding. And I think it's because it paints a picture of a God who knows us deeply in the way that we all long to be deeply known. It's a basic desire of the human heart. When Hagar is met by God during her journey, her first journey into the desert, he asks her a question. Where have you come from? Where are you going? And the answer is, I'm running away from my mistress, my tormentor. I have to wonder what our response would be if God were to ask us that same question. Where have you come from? Where are you going? For some of us, perhaps we might say we are running away. Maybe from a situation, or from ourselves, or even from God. Sometimes, especially when things are going really wrong, for example, this past week with the instances of active shooters, people get the impression that God is far off somewhere just watching, perhaps shaking his head saying, wow, people are really messed up. But God's not just a passive observer. He sees our situation, he hears our cries for help, and he does act. The problem is not in God's inaction. but rather in our lack of perception. We're often looking at the wrong side of the tapestry, or perhaps only a small, incomplete section that's still unfolding beneath the master weaver's hands. The same God who heard the cry of Hagar and Ishmael knows the needs of our hearts and our lives. God remains the Redeemer. He sent his only Son, Jesus Christ, who demonstrated through his life and death that every human life is of concern to God, even those lives to whom others have little time or respect for. And he proves through his resurrection that nothing, not even death itself, can separate us from his love, his presence, and his ultimate authority over all things. Let's pray together. Almighty God, El Rahim, blessed Redeemer, you are the God who sees us. You see our hopes and our dreams. You see our disappointments and our struggles and our places of deepest pain. Thank you that you are not a far-off God who simply observes our human condition, but rather one who intercedes and redeems our failures through the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Holy Spirit, teach us to look for the other side of God's tapestry, to see others, ourselves, and our circumstances through your eyes, and then to join with you in bringing living water to a world that's dying of thirst. In the powerful name of Jesus, we ask all these things. Amen.